When I did the fourth show in the Matters Arising series, the show entitled Kenya is Not a Jungle, I argued that self-styled political analysts who refer to Kenya as a jungle are singularly mistaken. Kenya is not a jungle. I argued that a jungle is a highly organized ecosystem, ruthlessly efficient, and impunity does not dwell there. On the contrary, Kenya is a highly disorganized, ruthlessly corrupt, man-eat-man ecosystem where impunity rules and thieves, looters, and political conmen thrive at the expense of everyone else. One of my viewers asked, if Kenya is not a jungle, what is it? And I think this is a good question, and one which has an obvious answer. Kenya is not a jungle. Kenya is a crime scene. It has been a crime scene for over 120 years now. The tragedy is that the robbers and the murderers have taken over the crime scene and they claim to be the investigators. Welcome. This is Matters Arising. Kenya is not a jungle. It is a crime scene. It has been a crime scene ever since the British colonialists came in and carved it out as part of the British Empire and claimed it for the imperial crown. They introduced institutionalized and legalized impunity, a situation where ordinary citizens were legally disenfranchised and the power vested on an illegitimate state that sought to keep people silent, in bondage, and in servitude to the crown by force. This was the original crime in the crime scene called Kenya. The crimes of the colonial regime are well documented and well preserved. They continue to be the interest of historians and anthropologists, and I would refer you to fairly accessible works like Caroline Elkin's Britain's Gulag, the brutal end of empire in Kenya, and people like David Anderson's Histories of the Hanged, the dirty war in Kenya and the end of empire. You can refer to those to see the crimes of the British Empire. To be sure, the current day characteristics of the crime scene we call Kenya were introduced by the colonial government. These range from state terror to state extortion to corruption, cronyism, profiteering, land grabbing, suffocating taxes, ethnic profiling, police brutality, human rights violations, displacement, political and economic disenfranchisement of the population, systematic impoverization of the citizens, and so on and so forth. The most significant and enduring legacy of the colonial regime is what has come to be known as extractive economic models and political institutions. This concept is best explained in a book titled Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty. And the book was first published in 2012 by a Turkish-American economist called Daron Acemoglu and a British political scientist called James Robinson. The authors explain that extractive political institutions concentrate power in the hands of a narrow elite and place few constraints on the exercise of this power. They sustain the economic institutions by strengthening the power of those who enjoy benefit from the extraction. Extractive institutions confiscate and deprive the people and obstruct the economic development. The foundation of these institutions is elites who design economic institutions in order to enrich themselves and perpetrate their power at the expense of the vast majority of people in society. I am sure you can immediately recognize the description of the Kenyan crime scene in that quotation. I repeat, the foundation of these institutions is elites who design economic institutions in order to enrich themselves and perpetrate their power at the expense of the vast majority of people in society. The establishment of extractive political and economic institutions was the original crime imposed on Kenya by the colonial government and inherited in toto by the local elites who took over power at independence. The result was that the crimes of the colonial government were swept under the carpet, and the local collaborator bourgeoisie class took instruments of power and became the new colonizers. The only thing that had changed on the crime scene we call Kenya was the color of the criminals. The late J.M. Kariuki described the crime scene well in 1970 when he said, "I believe firmly that substituting Kamau for Smith, Odongo for Jones, and Kiplagat for Keith won't solve what the gallant fighters of our Uhuru considered an imposed and undesirable social justice." But by the time JM was uttering this, the orgy of looting and consolidation of power for the criminals to protect themselves had already started. Democratic institutions were stifled, and within a few years of independence, Kenya was a de facto one-party state. Ashemoru and Robinson shed more light on this unholy alliance between extractive economics and extractive politics when they say, extractive economic institutions are synergistically linked to extractive political institutions, which concentrate power in the hands of a few, who will then have incentives to maintain and develop extractive economic institutions for the benefit and use of the resources they obtain to reinforce their hold on political power. This is how come the first 40 years of independence was a rap sheet of official state corruption and rape of the economy on the economic side, and political repression and criminalization of dissent on the other hand. Challenging political power was threatening the extractive economic institutions that supported the political elite and in turn reinforced their hold on power. It was simply unacceptable. On the other hand, those who were benefiting from the economic extractive institutions were expected to fully support the political establishment of the day. Nothing explains this crime scene better than the murder of the same J.M. Kariuki. He was a beneficiary of the extractive economic institutions and tragically tried to rattle the political establishment that supported these institutions. You see, the crime scene cannot be undermined by those benefiting from it. That you cannot contradict the political institutions that allowed you to eat was very clearly expressed by one of the mobsters in the know. When asked, why was J.M. Kariuki murdered? He replied matter-of-factly, he was talking while eating. The message had been sent as early as 1975. If we admit you into the crime scene and the criminals club, eat quietly. And that's what happened. By 1982, Kenya had become a de jure one-party state, and everyone was expected to cheer as a compredo political class laid the foundations of today's lootocracy. All institutions that could stop the criminal enterprise that government had become were in on the crime and were expected to support the government of the day. In 1984, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o quotes in his book Decolonizing the Mind, the then president Daniel Arap Moi told Kenyans, and I quote, I call on all ministers, assistant ministers, and every other person to sing like parrots. During Mzee Kenyatta's period, I persistently sang Mzee Kenyatta's tune. Therefore, you ought to sing the song I sing. If I put a full stop, you should put a full stop. This is how this country will move forward. And with that declaration, the crime scene had been cordoned off. The orgy of looting, repression, and murder started by the predecessor would be taken a notch higher. All the political and economic crimes of that regime and the current Jubilee regime are there for all to see. They are well documented in inquiries and reports from the 1975 Mwangale Parliamentary Select Committee report, to the John Troon inquiry, to the Goldenberg inquiry, to the numerous Auditor General reports, to the 2004 Ndungu report, the 1999 Akiwumi report, the 2008 Waki report, the 2008 Kregler report, the 2013 TJRC report, and so on and so forth. In fact, Kenya as a crime scene is even in the Scotland Yard files, and most recently, the crime scene is in the files of the International Criminal Court at The Hague. With the new political dispensation, there has been an effort to divorce the extractive political institutions with the extractive economic institutions. The aim was to dismantle the extractive political institutions to make them inclusive. Again, Ashemon and Robinson tell us that inclusive political institutions are those that distribute political power widely in a pluralistic manner. Unfortunately, this effort is being frustrated by the same KANU political class, currently manned by Moi political orphans, all of whom are beneficiaries of the crimes and the unholy union of the extractive political economic institutions of the KANU era. The thieves are still in charge of the crime scene, and that is why I have consistently argued that for us to make any progress in this country, we must inspire and invest in a new generation of young Kenyans. For so long as the robbers are the ones securing the crime scene, we will never get justice. Like I have said before, you are looking for your stolen goat with the guy who ate it. Kenya has been wrongly described as a jungle. It is not. It is a crime scene. And it has been a crime scene for the last 120 years. Extractive political institutions were established by the colonial government to facilitate extractive economic models and the looting of the country. At independence, the Comprador African elite who rose to power, courtesy of the British thieves and looters, were only too happy to preserve and strengthen the same extractive political and economic institutions to continue benefiting from the crime scene. Their sons, political and otherwise, now calling themselves Jubilee and NASA, are still in power, and they have preserved the crime scene so as to continue benefiting from the looting. The only way that the vision of inclusive political and economic institutions as envisaged in the new constitutional dispensation can be achieved is by running this political class out of town and preferably into jail. Until then, let us not confuse terms. Kenya is not a jungle. It is a crime scene. A jungle is a highly organized ecosystem where impunity doesn't exist. In Kenya, impunity has been institutionalized, And now the criminals have turned into investigators in the crime scene called Kenya. For Matters Arising, I'm Professor Wainaina.